before we get started tonight, thank you for coming, everybody. It's going to be so interesting tonight with Mr. Lloyd. But I just wanted to say one thing. He's going to be speaking about Frank Luke Jr., of course. And we are trying to get a state proclamation in Frank Luke's honor, because September 29th of this year will be the 100th anniversary of his death. As well, this is the end of World War I this year. So I've called the governor's office twice, and you can't get a proclamation even started until a minimum of 6 months before the date. So on March 30th, I will be calling back and then filling out the form. So just to let you know, hopefully we will have, and it's a Saturday, September 29th next fall will be in honor for the whole state of Frank Luke. So hopefully they will okay it.
And I'll let you model it since you're standing up. Oh, you're sitting down. We're fortunate enough again, and for all those who participated in our Veterans Day Parade, to again receive the #1 designation in the parade for military vehicles. So I appreciate all your efforts. Bill comes every year. Several of you in here are a part of that, and it's deeply appreciated because it's a lot of work. And then we had 2 vehicles that decided that they were going to die on us at the very end. We kind of figured out why after Mark and Dave and I discussed it. They're old vehicles. And when they don't have a lot of RPM for an extended period of time with the lights on, they're going to quit on their own time, not your time. So, if you want to take a look at it, it will be up here. One other thing, we're working again toward Luke Days, which has been changed in its dates. I think most everybody knows this, but to the 17th and 18th of March instead of the 7th and 8th. Actually, it's better because we don't compete with PIR, which is having races, the original date. Comes down to one man that was fooling around, that got relieved of his command, happened to be the leader of the Thunderbirds, that is not easily replaceable, so they could not show up. But not all things are bad. We actually got the Navy flying team coming in. If anybody's seen them, they are outstanding in their performance. Last time they were here in Arizona, at least at Luke, was 25 years ago, so it's been a long time. So we're welcoming them. We've got 2 premium spots, and actually we have 2 massive displays. One's going to be in the vehicles, which we have every year, and a lot of you folks have been involved with driving that, displaying weapons and this sort of thing. We're still planning all of that. And then we have a separate display because we're oriented toward Frank Luke and his 100th anniversary of service to the country. So I've got 3 military aircraft. One's kind of a work in progress, a Huey. Doc's bringing his Cayuse, which is fully restored. And then we're having a fly-in Cobra, which is the centerpiece. I'm going to have 2 of our Air Force trainers in front of that. And then I'm going to have a tent, a stand. This gentleman here is going to be in there talking about Frank Luke Jr. and his history, which you're going to be able to enjoy tonight.
Oh, I have to talk?
No,
I didn't know I had to talk then.
we can point at the pictures.
All right.
One of the things that becomes, if you get to go through the tent and see it, we've got a lot of pictures from World War II of individuals. And we're not going to put their names on there. We're going to put cards. I'm sorry, what? That was getting to my final point. The reason why it's important is a lot of the key players and leadership from World War II related directly back to World War I, including the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, who was a captain in the artillery out of Missouri. But anyhow, it's interesting to see photographs from World War I and what a Draken looks like. We're all going to learn about Drakens. Draken is, and this is my interpretation of German, it's a large sausage with a diaper. Draken. That's what it looks like. It's not. That's what they call it. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. I don't have a lot of information on you, Keith. But Keith came to one of our board meetings. When I found out about him, gave him a quick call. I think it was like 2 days' notice, and he came to one of our board meetings, talked to us because he had written this book. I think I was so cheap. I asked him, well, would you sign off on it and give me one? And he did.
I did.
And he signed off on it. And I brought it tonight in the red case. But he works actually for, I think it's fire department in Queen Creek?
Queen Creek. Yes.
Okay. But he lives in, is it Peoria?
Correct. Yeah.
So how that works, I don't know, but he seems to be okay with it. He's an author of, is it 2 or 3 other books?
It's 3 novels and
And this one here. I've read it from cover to cover. Very worthwhile, very easy read. But it tells a lot about Frank Luke that most people don't know. I reread one section because I got to tell you this real quick and I'm going to turn it over to you. This is going to run a little longer than 8 o'clock, so just an FYI. I tell folks this because it's kind of important to know. He was probably one of the most audacious flyers we had, particularly in World War I. He did not like to follow orders. He was this way with his commander all the time. And literally, he'd take off and just kind of do his own thing, and that's partly the reason why he shot down so many balloons. But the same person that he had this confrontational relationship with, after he lost his life, and I think it was in 2 or 3 weeks of his death, no, a month or so of his death, he put him in for the Medal of Honor. He is the only and the first Medal of Honor for the state, as a pilot. And he was born and raised in Phoenix, which was a territory at that time. So, anyhow, with that, Keith, the floor is yours.
We all
Thank
get
you.
our own book.
You may want to dim the lights a little bit
Sure.
here so they can. We can. That sounds loud to me. Is that too loud?
It's good.
Okay.
We'll hardly hear you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. Yes, I wrote the book Above and Beyond about Frank Luke Jr. when I was really young. My dad was retired Air Force. I was a Navy guy, so I'm not broken up about the Navy being at Luke days. But my dad was retired Air Force. We spent a lot of time out at Luke Air Force Base, and I learned about Luke, Frank Luke, at that time. And I wanted to write an account of Frank Luke's life. I wanted to write something that was readable, that was concise, and I wanted to do it for my fellow Arizonans. So that's really what compelled me to write the book. I struggled with the title for a little while. At first I called it The Eagle of Arizona because he was from Arizona, and the squadron he belonged to was known as the Eagle Squadron. And I didn't really like that title. I settled on Above and Beyond. And the reason why I did is if you read a Medal of Honor citation, it always begins with, for conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty, at the risk of life. And I think by the time you get done hearing the story tonight, you'll agree that he truly went above and beyond the call of duty. So that's why I titled this book Above and Beyond. So Frank Luke Jr. was born in 1897 in Phoenix, Arizona. At the time, Phoenix was a small farming community in the Salt River Valley of 5,500 people. And to give you some perspective on that number, that's the population of Litchfield Park today. So that's how small Phoenix, Arizona was in 1897 when Frank was born. Frank's father was Frank Sr., obviously, was a German immigrant, ironically enough. And he was a miner, and then he became a shopkeeper. He was a rather successful shopkeeper. The Luke family is still rather successful in business in Phoenix. He ended up going into local politics. He married a young lady by the name of Tilly Liebenau, Ottilia Liebenau, they called her Tilly, and she was also of German and French descent. And together they had 9 children. And they settled in a little house on East Washington Street in Phoenix, and then once Frank Sr. got a little bit more successful, they bought a really nice Victorian home that was at 2200 West Monroe Street, which was at the edge of the Phoenix city limits at the time. And right now it's right downtown. You could hit the state capitol with a rock from his old house. Frank was the fifth of 9. So he was right in the middle, and for those of you that believe in middle child syndrome, he's pretty indicative of a middle child. His father said that he was an industrious boy. He was a good boy at home. He was always honest and industrious. His mother said that he was into everything. As soon as he was old enough to toddle, he was into everything, for he was full of life. That's how she described it. He was a very, very energetic young man. By the time he was old enough to go to school, it was really hard to keep him at home. He played about every sport that the Phoenix School District offered. He was in baseball, football, boxing, tennis, basketball, even did a little ballroom dancing. One of the things that Frank liked to do more than anything else, though, was he'd go on horseback, and he would go out on long, and I mean long, range camping trips, hunting and camping trips with his 2 best friends, Albert Penny, who they nicknamed Pidge, and his other friend Bill Elder, who he hung out with probably the most. And they would go on very, very long horseback trips to the Arizona backcountry. They would go from downtown Phoenix all the way up into the Superstition Mountains. They go up into the White Mountains to go hunting, and they would go out literally for weeks. It taught Frank to be self-reliant. Nobody was going to come to his rescue if he got in trouble, and he had to learn how to improvise things. He learned how to hunt, and that's where he owed a lot of his marksmanship to the fact that he was out in the Arizona backcountry, and if they wanted to eat, they had to be able to shoot. So one of the most famous anecdotes about Frank's trips to the backcountry of Arizona is he was up in the White Mountains with his friend Bill Elder, and a storm had come through, and White River in the White Mountains was running pretty high. And Frank decided he wanted to cross White River, and the Apache Indians that were nearby, they said, "Don't do it." And Frank, being Frank, is rather headstrong, and he decided he was going to do it anyway. So they started crossing the river. Their pack mule got swept away. Bill Elder got swept away. Frank had to jump in the river and save his friend's life. Gives you an idea of how headstrong this young man was. By the time he graduated high school, he was 5'10". He was 155 pounds, and he was. Again, he seemed like he had a strong sense of right and wrong if you talked to the people that knew him back then. He also had a religious streak, believe it or not. When you talked to his mother, there was a soldier that served with Frank that came back from the war and visited his parents in Phoenix. And his mother told him that Frank was very religious. He was a devout Christian. He was very upset by what was going on in Europe before America entered the war. He heard about the atrocities that the Germans committed in Belgium and in France, and he was very upset by that. So he had a strong sense of right and wrong, and a willingness to defend others. So after high school, Frank became interested in the mining industry. The mining industry was blowing up in Arizona. Copper was a big deal at that time. And he took a job down in Ajo, at the New Cornelia Copper Workings down in Ajo. And what his job down there was, he was an electrolytic tank operator, where they were able to use electrolysis to refine copper ore. And so he started out with an interest in the copper industry, and I think that's the career that he was looking forward. But events halfway around the world were happening that would change his life forever. The First World War had been going on since August of 1914. And a generation of young European males was being virtually annihilated. It was a horrible, horrible war, the likes of which the world had never seen before. To give you some perspective on the numbers of how horrible the First World War was, the type of carnage that was going on the Western Front. On day one of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, 21,000 British soldiers were killed. On day one. of the battle. If you ever wonder where day one comes from, you've heard that expression before. Day one, that situation is screwed up since day one, or that guy's been a screw up since day one. That's where it comes from. American soldiers joined the fight. They went over to Europe. They talked to British troops. That was in their vernacular, and they brought that home, and it became a phrase in American slang. It was day one, and that's where it came from. It came from day one of the song. 1.7 million German, 1.3 million French, and 900,000 British soldiers were killed in the First World War. 53,000 Americans were killed in the First World War. And to lend some perspective to that number, can anybody tell me combat deaths? How many did we lose in Vietnam?
58,000.
Okay, 58,000's on the wall. It's 47,000 KIA though. I mean, there's accidents and there's illnesses and things like that. But of the KIA, it's 47,000 in World War I. We were engaged in World War I for 18 months. We were involved in Vietnam for 20 years. So that gives you an idea of the carnage that was going on the Western Front. And I'm talking just combat deaths there. 41 million civilians died in the First World War, and the damage to the economy, to the infrastructure, was just absolutely incalculable. The reason for this was that you had generals that were deploying and using Napoleonic tactics, but we had 20th century weapons. The machine gun, for example. The machine gun was used prior to the First World War, in some conflicts prior to the First World War, by the British in South Africa, for example. But the First World War saw the first mass production of machine guns, and the first time it was used on a mass scale. And obviously, if you're leaving your trenches to move forward and assault a position, a machine gun makes that very difficult when you're out operating in the open. That was responsible for a lot of the casualties. Artillery had been perfected by the First World War. It was very capable of tremendous range and firepower, and it was also responsible for a lot of the casualties. Tanks were used for the first time in the First World War, as was chemical weapons. Poisonous gas was used extensively, which killed and maimed thousands. And then there was the airplane, which at first was thought to be of little use militarily, but then it turned out to be as deadly a weapon as any other. There was another new weapon that was being used primarily by the German Navy, and that was the Unterseeboot, or the U-boat, or the submarine. And the Germans used it extensively because they needed to interdict the supply convoys of ships that were coming from the New World to the Old World to resupply the French and the British. The raw materials that they were buying from the U.S. and from Canada and from the Latin American states were being shipped over into British factories, French factories, to produce war material, along with food. Food was a big commodity that was being shipped from the New World to the Old World, and the Germans were doing everything they can to interdict that, to stop Allied shipping. To do so, they employed the use of unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant they would sink any ship, regardless of what flag it was flying, if they knew or suspected that it was carrying war material. And that brought them into conflict with the United States. The United States had flagged vessels were shipping some materials over to Britain and to France, and the Germans sank them. The Cunard liner Lusitania was sunk in 1915. 128 Americans were on board, along with 1,200 other people who died. That pretty much evaporated any isolationist sentiment in the United States. There was a strong feeling that we didn't need to get involved in a European war. Most Americans didn't want to get involved at all. But when that happened, that's when the isolationist sentiment started going away, and the tide of public opinion in America started turning toward Germany, even though there were a lot of German-American immigrants in the United States. And they certainly didn't want to go to war against their home country. The final provocation was when it was discovered that the Germans had approached Mexico with the with a prospect of a military alliance to take back the territory that they had lost in Mexican-American War, that being California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And the Germans basically said that they would finance and support any effort by Mexico to invade the United States should the United States declare war on Germany. The Mexicans refused that, but it was discovered, what the Zimmerman telegram was what it was called. It was discovered, and when that happened, that's pretty much what drove the United States to go to war against Germany. So on April 6, 1917, 50 years to the day before I was born, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, which they did. So the problem was America was not prepared. The U.S. Navy, hoorah, was good to go. They were, and as they always are, they had a modern battle fleet under the Wilson administration, the Roosevelt administration, McKinley administration. They had developed a modern battle fleet, so they were ready to go. America, however, did not have a large standing army. That was not in our custom at the time. We're used to thinking of the United States Army as being one of the largest, most powerful armies in the world, but we did not always have a large standing army. So it was going to take some time to equip and train an army to send overseas to join the Allies, the French and the British, to fight Germany. We also had no Air Force to speak of. Even though we invented the airplane in the United States, the Wright brothers invented the airplane a few years before the war started, other industrialized nations like Germany, like France, like Britain had developed combat aircraft at a breakneck pace. They had developed several different types of airplanes for combat. America had no combat aircraft when they declared war. They had some training aircraft and observation aircraft. The Air Force, as we know it today, did not exist. It was the aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps at the time. It wasn't even the U.S. Army Air Corps yet, as some of you may remember it from history. So it was going to take some time to train and to train some pilots and get them overseas to be able to fight. There were some Americans that were already doing that. There were American men that volunteered. Some of them crossed into Canada and joined the Royal Flying Corps and were flying with the British. Some of them had gone to France and had joined the French Foreign Legion and had transferred from there to a unit that was known as the Lafayette Escadrille. Lafayette Escadrille was a volunteer unit that fought for the French. Fortunately for the United States, what this meant was that there was a cadre of Americans that had combat experience. And they were, not all of them, but several of them, most of them were transferred to the U.S. Army after they declared war on Germany. And they formed the nucleus of the U.S. Army Air Service, as it came to be called. They became squadron leaders, they became training officers, and operations officers, and they were the ones that formed the nucleus of the American Air Service that went to France. The first aircraft that, I'm getting back to Frank Luke here, I'm giving you a little background. The first aircraft that were used in the First World War were not used for combat. They were used for observation. There was a lot of resistance, particularly in America, by some of the American Army officers, the old guard of West Point Army officers. They were resistant to the development of military aviation. They saw it as good for reconnaissance and not much else. The first aircraft that were used in World War I were two-seater reconnaissance aircraft, and because the Western Front was fairly stagnant, you had an enormous German army, you had enormous British and French armies. They were nose-to-nose on the French countryside. They had protracted trench warfare, slugging it out. And the only way they could really get good reconnaissance information was to fly over enemy lines and take photographs, draw sketches, take notes, come back, give that information to battery commanders, to unit commanders, so that they could formulate their plans. So initially, believe it or not, at the beginning stages of the war, you would have opposing aircraft, German and French and British aircraft, that were passing one another, and the pilots would wave to each other. As the war became more nasty and more bitter and the hatred started to grow, that changed. They started carrying pistols, they started carrying rifles, and they would start taking pot shots at one another as they were taking reconnaissance photographs. That evolved into machine guns being mounted on a two-seat reconnaissance aircraft. And here you go. So if your enemy is able to fly an airplane over your positions and take photographs, what are you going to want to do? You want to shoot them down. You're going to want to stop them from getting that information back to the enemy generals. So single-seater, single-seater airplanes were developed that were fast and maneuverable, that could chase down the reconnaissance aircraft and shoot them down. The French called them chars avions, which meant chase planes. The Americans changed that to pursuit. And they didn't call them fighter planes for quite a while, actually. They were called pursuit planes for a long time, and that stayed in the U.S. nomenclature for a very long time, up into World War II and beyond. The P-51 Mustang, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The P stands for pursuit. So that was what they called fighter planes, and then they called them pursuit planes. This is a French Newport 11 that was being flown by the Lafayette Escadrille. That's their logo right there. And right here you can see they have a 30 caliber Lewis machine gun that is mounted, or 303 caliber Lewis machine gun that is mounted above the tips of the propeller, so you can fire over the tips of the propeller. And the whole purpose for this aircraft is to chase down enemy observation planes and shoot them down. That all changed, though, with this gentleman. Anthony Fokker was a Dutch aircraft engineer. And Anthony developed a system, you can see it right here, he developed a system to synchronize the firing of the machine gun with the rotation of the propeller. What he did was he put a little cam on the back of the propeller shaft, is connected to a series of rods that interrupted the machine gun's firing mechanism when the blade of the propeller spun around. And that turned the chase plane into a very, very deadly weapon. This is Eddie Rickenbacker with his SPAD 13, and you can see he has two Vickers machine guns that are mounted, synchronized to fire through the propeller there. So eventually what you had, and this happened around the latter part of 1915, 1916, you would have patrols of chase planes going out looking for reconnaissance aircraft, and they would run into one another, and then they would fight each other. And so then you had what is known as the dogfight. The chase pilots, the pursuit pilots, fighter pilots, whatever you want to call them, I'm going to start calling them fighter pilots from now on because it's just easier for me. But they became very popular heroes in the popular press. A pilot that shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft was known as an ace. That was in the popular expressions of the time. If you were a Tour de France bicyclist that was a champion, you were known as an ace. If you were a jockey that was really good, you were known as an ace. So that was what they called somebody who was really good at what they did. And so pilots that shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft became known as aces. Some of the more noteworthy aces, whoops, hold on. Okay, some of the more noteworthy aces, I mean, if you know nothing about World War I history or aviation, you probably know who this guy is. If you've ever shopped for frozen pizza, you probably know who this guy is. Okay, Rittmeister Baron Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron. He was a descendant of German aristocracy. He was a Prussian cavalry officer who transferred to their air arm and became the ace of aces of the First World War. He shot down 80 Allied aircraft. Baron von Richthofen was a controversial figure. He was to say that he was a national hero in Germany would be a gross understatement. He was a rock star in Germany. He was controversial, though. He's been accused over the years of being a propaganda hero, if you will, because he came from German aristocracy. He personified the model German officer. He was known to not to stay on his side of the lines. He wouldn't often venture onto the British side of the lines. He stayed in the German side of the lines, often did it with a large formation of aircraft, and when I say large, I mean 50 at a time. The British would call that not very sporting. I would call that not very stupid. But he only attacked when the odds were heavily in his favor. And the only time that he strayed away from those standards, went over to the British side of the lines, or strayed away from his formation, he got shot up. The third time he did it, it was for good. But anyway.
Before you move on,
Yes.
is that the blue mat?
That is the blue Manx. That is the Pour le Mérite right there that he is wearing, yes. This gentleman right here, Captain Albert Ball. I put guys up here that, again, these are noteworthy, but I think these were the ones that really personified the flyers of their nations. Captain Albert Ball was the darling of the Royal Flying Corps. Very young gentleman. He was a devout Episcopalian. He, in order to calm himself between missions, he would play the violin. He was a very pious young gentleman. He took his commitment to king and country very seriously, though. He shot down 44 enemy aircraft before he himself was killed. The complete opposite of Captain Albert Ball was this gentleman right here, France's Charles Nungesser. Charles was a bit of a flamboyant nut. He would wear his decorations even when he was flying, and not just the ribbons. He would wear the medals also. Charles had been shot and had been injured in crashes more times than could be counted. You'll note the scar on his chin right there. That's where he got shot in the mouth. But obviously he survived it. Charles loved his fast cars, he loved his women, and he loved his champagne. It was not uncommon for Charles to show up for the dawn patrol that he was scheduled to fly, driving the captured German staff car that he owned with one or more lovely ladies in his company. And he would throw a flying coat over the tuxedo that he was wearing from his night on the town in Paris and go fly his mission before breakfast. So if you're wondering where the Hollywood image of the swashbuckling, larger-than-life fighter pilot came from, look no further than Charles Nungesser. I would have liked to party with Charles. So, some of the aircraft from the First World War that don't know anything about World War I aviation, you probably recognize this aircraft. This is a Fokker DR-1, the Fokker triplane, which was flown by the Red Baron. That's him right there, actually, in the snow. The workhorse of the German Air Force, though, was the Albatross. By the time Frank Luke arrived on the scene, it was the Fokker D-7 was replacing both the triplane and the Albatross, and that was the premier fighter plane of Germany in the latter part of the war. And some people will tell you that it was the finest fighter airplane that was produced during the war. The British had the SE-5, and they had the Sopwith Camel. Now, I would like to take this moment to clear up a common misconception. This is not what a Sopwith Camel looks like. No. This is what a Sopwith Camel looks like, contrary to popular belief. Okay, the Americans, as I said before, American aircraft manufacturers were way behind the eight ball. They did not produce, they only produced a handful of combat aircraft. They didn't have any in their inventory when they started the war. So America purchased aircraft from the British and the French. Mostly the French. The two types that they flew the most were these two here. This is the Newport 28, which was flown by American pilots on the Western Front, and then the Spad 13. This is Eddie Rickenbacker, who was the American ace of aces, posing with his Spad 13. So those were the two aircraft that the American pilots flew the most. Okay, so back to Frank now. Frank volunteered to become a fighter pilot in the U.S. Army Air Service, and at the time that he started, it was still the Signal Corps of the aviation section of the Signal Corps. This is his application. And right here it says that he applied to be a first lieutenant, not a second lieutenant. So either he wanted to jump ahead of rank, or he didn't know enough about Army rank structure. But so he applied as a first lieutenant. It says here that he went to Phoenix High School. He was born in 1897 in Phoenix, Arizona. He's 5'10", 155 pounds. He's a machine inspector for electrolytic tanks, New Cornelia Copper Company. And he promises letters of recommendation from the superintendent of city schools, from the editor of the Arizona Gazette, and the Maricopa County treasurer. And he signed it, has his address here, 2200 West Monroe Street, Phoenix, Arizona. He applied on August 24th, 1917 for pilot training. He didn't hear back from them for quite some time. And Frank wasn't a very patient young man, was not a very patient young man, and so he waited a couple weeks and then he fired off a postcard to the Army. And if you read it, it sounds a little terse, and it says here, kindly let me know when I may expect a call for service. And the card, you can see here on different handwriting, it says September 29th, Texas. And I suspect that that was probably written down by the officer that processed his request. The ironic thing about that is that he was told to report for duty on September 29th, 1917. What happened on September 29th, 1918? Yes, he died exactly 1 year later from the time that he reported for duty. Just an important aside here that I think is worth noting, where he says that he's a machine inspector for electrolytic tanks, New Cornelia Copper Company. There wasn't a whole lot of time that elapsed between the time he graduated high school and he applied for a commission in the Army. And even back then, the Army was looking for at least some college for you to be able to fly. And so, and this is just speculation on my part, I'm wondering if this may not have been a little, shall we say, embellished. Because there was, maybe they thought that he had significant technical background to where he could be accepted for pilot training. Eddie Rickenbacker, for example, never set foot on a college campus either, but he was a race car driver. He was a manager of a racing team. He had a lot of mechanical background and aptitude. He was very well known, and he was accepted for pilot training. So I'm kind of wondering if that was the case. But anyway, he did get accepted, and his first duty station was in San Antonio, Texas. He went to the School of Military Avionics that had been established in San Antonio, Texas. What we called it in the Navy a knife and fork school for officers, where they just basically learned the 90-day wonder kind of thing, where you basically learned your military customs and courtesies and close order drill and things of that nature. And then paired with that was also what we would call today ground school for pilots. And they also learned about aircraft engines and weaponry. And here's a picture of Frank at SMA in San Antonio with a Vickers machine gun. After ground school, he was shipped out to a little sand spit in the middle of San Diego Harbor that is now the most expensive property in Southern California, and it is Coronado Island. And at the time, it was Rockwell Field. You can see that's the peninsula there, and here's some Navy seaplanes that were at Rockwell Field. And that is where Frank got his wings. While he was there, he wrote back home, said, "Oh boy, this is so exciting. This is such a wonderful, wonderful thing that I've done. It's exciting to be flying over the ocean and over the mountains and see the world spread out beneath you and everything." However, he showed his first signs when he was there of butting heads with his commanders. They told him, they said, "Do not do aerobatics in these quote-unquote old aircraft." These were Curtiss Jennies. These were the training airplanes that the Army was using at the time, and they were considered obsolete. And they were a little tired, had a lot of hours on the airframes, and so they told them, "Don't do aerobatics." Well, Frank, being Frank, and you're going to hear me say that over and over again during this story, Frank attempted to do a loop. He fell out of the loop, went into a spin, barely recovered, almost crashed his airplane, and he was grounded for 48 hours in consequence. Somehow, while he was there, he was able to find himself a girlfriend, a young lady by the name of Marie Repson, who was a high school senior in San Diego. And before Luke left San Diego, the two of them were engaged to be married. They didn't do a wartime hurried wedding. However, they decided to wait until after the war was over. So in February of 1918, Frank shipped out for Phoenix for his leave prior to going over to France. And he was commissioned, he earned his wings, and he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the aviation section of the Army Signal Corps. Before he left, he wrote a letter to his father. When he was getting on the ship in New York to go to France, he wrote a letter to his father, and he told his dad, if anything happens to me, I don't want you to feel bad, because I want you to know that I'll be happy that I have done my duty. So, his first duty station in France was at the 3rd Aviation Instructional Center, which was at a town called Issoudun, which well behind the lines in the rear echelon. And that is where they learned how to fly combat aircraft. It didn't make any sense to send a bunch of combat aircraft over to the United States and train them there. They trained them how to fly in the United States. They trained them how to fly fighter planes when they were in France. And so they had this school at Issoudun, and that's where most of the pilots went through. They were flying Newports at the time. Frank, again, being Frank, fell out of formation. He would try to do stunts, and again, he was chafing against the bridle of military discipline. And one time he ran out of fuel and he landed in a lady's garden. Another time he attempted to do a spin. He lost control of the spin. His seatbelt came unfastened. He started falling out of the cockpit, grabbed the upper wing of the airplane, forced himself back in, was able to regain control of the airplane and finally land it. The airfield sent over the crash crew and the ambulance because they thought he crashed. One of the soldiers that saw it happen said that it made him physically sick just watching it. So, and he was grounded for that one too. He was retained at Issoudun longer than most people. One of the people that was his instructor, one of his instructors at Issoudun was Quentin Roosevelt. He was the son of Theodore Roosevelt. And Quentin actually liked Frank and had a lot of good things to say about him, and thought that despite some of the stuff that was written in his evaluations, Roosevelt actually thought that Frank was very promising as an aviator. Roosevelt himself, by the way, ended up getting attached to the 95th Aero Squadron, and in July of 1918 he was killed in action. In that same month, in July of 1918, the 27th Aero Squadron, which belonged to the 1st Pursuit Group stationed at Sens, which was involved in the thick of the fight, they lost some pilots in combat and they requested some replacements. And so Frank, who at the time was being used as a ferry pilot to take replacement aircraft up to the front, he was assigned to the 27th Aero Squadron as a fighter pilot. Frank's commanding officer was a gentleman by the name of Harold Hartney. Harold was a Canadian, actually, and he had served with the Royal Flying Corps. He started out as a cavalry officer, and he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps. A very experienced combat aviator. He was seconded to the U.S. Army Air Service to help because they needed experienced commanders. Harold was a very popular commander. He took on kind of a coaching type of leadership style, and he was very popular with the American pilots. Took his leadership very seriously. He was the kind of man that led from the front. He was actually shot down by the Red Baron at one time, but obviously he survived it. Okay, so at the time that Frank joined the 27th Aero Squadron, they were transitioning from the Newport to the Spad. And there's Frank with his Spad there. The reason why they were doing this is for several reasons. One of them is the fact that the Newport had the nasty habit of shedding its fabric off of its upper wing under combat maneuvers. And if you're pulling a lot of G's in combat maneuvers, that's not a good thing for your airplane to be falling apart. So the Newport had a bit of a dainty airframe. It was more of a maneuverable airplane. The Spad was more rugged. The Spad was also very fast. The Newport and the Fokker D7, which was their main opponent, both of them had 160 horsepower engines. The Spad had a 220 horsepower engine, so it had quite a bit of speed. It could dive like a Falcon, and it was a very unforgiving airplane also. At slow speeds, it had the habit of falling out of the sky and stalling. But so it took some getting used to. There were some pilots that were very unhappy that they switched from the Newport to the Spad. One of them was Harold Hartney. Eddie Rickenbacker loved the Spad, and he was glad to get rid of the Newport. So it just depended on who you go. Here's James Meissner right here of the 94th Aero Squadron. He just got done shedding all the fabric from his Newport's upper wing. Here's his mechanic holding the wing up, smiling. Meissner is not smiling. That actually happened to Meissner twice, and he survived it both times. The same day that Frank joined the 27th Aero Squadron, another young gentleman joined the squadron. His name was Joseph F. Vayner. Joseph F. Vayner was a young man from Massachusetts. He had gone to the prestigious Phillips Exeter Academy. After that, he had gone to, became part of the YMCA legation in Germany. And he was in Germany on behalf of the YMCA, making sure that Allied prisoners were being treated appropriately. Once the United States declared war on Germany, he was repatriated back to the United States along with American diplomats. The problem with that is that he had a German last name, and there was a lot of disdain for German Americans at that time. Even though most German Americans were very loyal, many of them fought for the United States against their home country, but they were fiercely loyal Americans, and Joe was no exception. However, Joe was investigated by the Secret Service and by the Justice Department as a possible enemy agent when he came back. And he applied for pilot training. He was accepted, but the fact that he had been investigated as a spy followed him wherever he went. It even followed him all the way through training, and by the time he got to the 27th Aero Squadron, and nobody would talk to him. He was kind of shunned by his fellow flyers. Matter of fact, they nicknamed him Fritz. And that may not seem like it's very bad, but could you imagine, and I see a lot of you gentlemen are wearing hats that say that you're Vietnam veterans. That would be very similar to having an Asian American in your unit in Vietnam and you nicknamed him Charlie. Because Fritz is what they called German soldiers at the time. So it was a pretty nasty insult to call him that. Frank was also ostracized when he got there. The reason being is that the 27th was no exception to this. Most of the flying squadrons in the U.S. Army Air Service, they were made up of gentlemen that were from the upper crust of American society, really. They were from elite families in the East Coast with old money. They went to elite schools, and they were expected to go to elite units and do elite things. And you had a lot of gentlemen here that were from Princeton and from Harvard and from Dartmouth and some of the Yale and some of those colleges where they had flying clubs, and so it was natural for them. The redneck from Arizona didn't fit in very well. And when he got there, he put off a lot of people at the outset. Really, is how Don Luke described it. He rubbed people the wrong way. He was very energetic. Frank had a habit of walking fast, of talking fast. He was just a very energetic young man, and he was very boastful. I don't think it was in an arrogant way. I think he was just very confident in his abilities, and he basically told them he was going to come home with the Kaiser's helmet and whip the Germans single-handedly. And these gentlemen that had already been in combat, that were from a completely different segment of society, they were a little bit put off by Frank. So the two of them, Frank and Joe, became friends. They were the two black sheep of their, as I put it in the book, they were the two black sheep of their newfound military family. Hartney actually took a liking to Frank. Hartney started out as a cavalry officer in Saskatchewan, and so he had some people from the backcountry too. In his unit, he understood rugged people, people that were individualists, and he kind of took a liking to Frank. He took Frank, so to speak, under his wing and started training Frank separate and apart from training other pilots. He gave Frank special attention. These guys here, they called Frank Hartney's boyfriend. That was the insult that they attached to him. So, yeah. So to make matters worse, Frank flew his first combat patrol on 16 August 1918. It got off to a very bad start. The 27th was using the SPADs for the first time. The mechanics are not used to the new engines yet on the SPADs. The SPADs often flooded on takeoff. I'm sorry, on starting. When the patrol took off, one of the pilots joined the squadron the same day as Frank crashed on takeoff, and he was killed. So the flight took off behind schedule. Frank got separated from the formation during the flight, and one by one the planes started dropping out of formation because they were having engine trouble, and Hartney was also one of them. There was an advanced airfield at a town called Quincy, and Hartney was very, very irritated, landed his new plane there. He was very upset at the SPAD. He was upset at the Hisso engine in the SPAD. He was upset at the high command for making him change from a Newport to a SPAD. And when he got to this advanced airfield, several of his pilots had similar problems with there. A few minutes later came Frank circling overhead, and he was ready to land. And the pilots of the 27th gathered around Hartney's airplane. They said, "You watch. He's going to claim that he was shot down a German." Sure enough, Frank landed, went up to Hartney, and he said, "I got me a Hun." Well, nobody believed him. It was an unconfirmed, nobody saw it happen. And Frank claimed that he founded formation of German airplanes, and then he dropped down from a height down to the tail end Charlie there and shot down the rearmost German airplane. Nobody saw it, and that just added to the disdain that his fellow pilots had for him. And to make matters even worse than that, Hartney who was basically Frank's coach. He was transferred to command of the 1st Pursuit Group, which was the parent command of the 27th Aero Squadron. On August 21st, 1918, this gentleman here, Alfred Grant, was named commander of the 27th Squadron, and so he was Frank's commanding officer. And the problem with that is that this was one of the gentlemen that had a hard time with Frank Luke, and it wasn't long before the two of them were butting heads. Okay, so 12 September 1918, the Americans' liability, however, they did it on purpose in order to interdict the railway lines that ran back and forth here so they could interrupt the French railway system. The objective of the Americans was to reduce the salient, so they were planning a two-pronged attack on September 12th, 1918, and so the pressure was on for the Americans to perform. 300,000 Americans were involved in this attack. So Billy Mitchell was the commander of the First Army Air Service commander, and this is Billy Mitchell right here with General Pershing, who was the overall commander of American forces in Europe at the time. And Mitchell's orders were that the U.S. Army, the First Army attacks on the whole front 0500 September 12th. The Air Force is going to take the offensive at all points with the object of destroying the enemy air services, attacking his groups on the ground, and protecting our planes and ground troops. Maintain a barrage against hostile aviation, observation aviation, and hostile balloons, is what it says. So that night, on September 11th, 1918, the night before the offensive kicked off, the pilots of the 27th were in the officers' mess, and they started discussing this operations order that I just read to you. And this gentleman right here, Jerry Vasconcelos, he was a flight commander of B Flight of the 27th Squadron, and he was experienced, relatively experienced, and he was popular leader in the squadron. And the pilots listened to Jerry when he talked, and he said that anybody who attacks a balloon has my respect. And they were talking about the fact that they were ordered to go up against enemy balloon positions tomorrow, and they didn't want to. Reason why, the Drachen, which is not translated as a sausage with a diaper, it is translated as a dragon, actually. But nice try, though, sir. The observation balloons were used by both sides during the war, and they were used to great effect. They were oblong canvas structures that were filled with a highly volatile gas of hydrogen gas. Think Hindenburg, same gas. Okay, to make them lighter than air. They had a gondola slung underneath them. They were captive balloons, or kite balloons is what the British called them. They were winched on a steel cable 2,000 feet in the air, and they could see for miles. There was a trained observer that would be, 1 or 2 trained observers would be in the balloon, and they would observe enemy positions. They would plot them. They would call in artillery fire. They had a telephone, a field telephone in the basket there that had a line that ran down to a switchboard, and they could talk to directly to battery commanders. So they could call in artillery fire. They could correct the artillery fire in real time. And when I was in the service, I kept hearing this expression, "When the balloon goes up." When the balloon goes up, you better be ready. When the balloon goes up, you better have your act together, have your gear, get ready to go when the balloon goes up. Anybody heard that before? Yeah. Okay, I never knew where that came from, and they kept saying when the balloon goes up. What balloon are they talking about? I kept going outside and looking for balloons. Well, this is where that came from. It came from the First World War. And when the balloon goes up, what that means is something bad is going to happen. And when the balloon was up in the First World War, you couldn't move. Any overt movement by your unit would call in observed indirect fire on your position. And so everybody hated these things and they wanted to get rid of them. They were very effective in their task. But you say to yourself, you look at that and you go, well, that thing's a sitting duck. It's a big bag of hydrogen gas. What's so hard about shooting that thing down? Well, this is the problem. The problem was it was a high value asset, and it was surrounded by multiple batteries of anti-aircraft artillery, special anti-aircraft mortars and heavy machine guns known as flaming onions that they would shoot up into the air, as well as several batteries of machine guns. These things were veritably ringed by anti-aircraft batteries. And if you think about it, if you're trying to shoot down an airplane with an anti-aircraft gun, what is the one thing you need to know? You need to know the approximate altitude of that aircraft in order to be able to set your fuses, right? You know what the altitude is because you know how high the balloon is. And World War I airplanes had to get in pretty close in order to deliver enough ammunition into a balloon in order to shoot it down. And so they could throw up a curtain of lead in the face of an attacking pilot. That was the problem. And if you survive that, and you're able to put enough ammo into that balloon to blow it up, and it didn't blow up in your face, these guys were waiting for you overhead. There were flights of German aircraft that were tasked with nothing more than protecting those balloons. And so they were flying upstairs, ready to pounce on you if you attacked them. So basically, attacking a balloon was considered a suicide mission. And in the back of the room was sitting Frank Luke and Joseph Wehner, listening to everything that was being said. A little footage for you about balloons here. I'm just going to show you this really quick, just a few seconds, but I think it's worth seeing. This is actually an Royal Australian Air Force balloon that was being used in the First World War, being deployed. And pretty soon you're going to see an aircraft attack this thing and shoot it down. Some of this is staged, but some of it is actual footage. And when you slow down the footage, you can see it's actually a Fokker D-7. The balloon observers were the only ones that were issued parachutes, by the way. Pilots in the aircraft were not.
Yeah, explain that because it's a very interesting theory.
What's that?
It's a very interesting theory. Explain that.
That they didn't have parachutes? Yeah, they were. Well, the parachutes were also in an experimental stage, but it was thought that you would basically ride the airplane down and jump out. Some pilots carried revolvers with them with the express purpose of shooting themselves if their airplane caught on fire because they had no way of bailing out. And some pilots said if it ever happened to them, they would jump rather than burn to death in their airplane. They didn't have parachutes. They didn't have a protective armor. They didn't have any of the things that the pilots of the Second World War had. Okay, so on the 12th September 1918, the offensive began. It started with a massive artillery barrage. The weather was horrible. It was raining cats and dogs. So consequently, the flight schedule went to heck in a handbasket. Along with engine trouble and the bad weather, the first flight of the day from the 27th that was supposed to go out and hunt down enemy balloons didn't take off as a group. They took off one at a time. And some pictures of the assault beginning here. When that happened, Frank went up to Joseph Vayner on the flight line before they left, and he said, "Remember what Vasconcelos said about the balloons last night?" And Joe said, "Yeah, why?" And Frank said, "I'm going to get a balloon today." Well, people overheard that, and they went, "Here he goes again." You know, the guy who lied about shooting down a German plane, now he's bragging that he's going to shoot down a balloon. Well, Frank took off on his own, because as I said, there were other planes in the formation. It wasn't a formation. They took off singularly. Frank took off for the enemy lines. He crossed the lines and in a village called Marios, over at this village in German-held territory. Hanging there in the morning mist, he spotted a Drachen. So Frank dove on the balloon. He fired at it. He had to clear stoppages in his machine gun. He made 3 separate passes at the thing. It was almost down to the ground. The Germans started winching it down when he started attacking it. They were shooting at him with everything they had. They almost got it down into its protective pit before he made his final attack, which exploded the balloon almost on top of the winch. The young gentleman who was the observer it was his first time up in the balloon. He actually took one in the chest and died instantly. But Frank had his first victory. He flew from there to the headquarters of the American 5th Observation Balloon Company and landed his airplane. Made them very nervous because they knew that the Germans saw him land and they were afraid that would call in artillery on them. Frank got out of his rather shot to pieces Spad, walked up to them and said, "Did you see me shoot down that enemy balloon?" They said, "Yeah, it was really hard to miss." He said, "Sign here." So Frank was not about to have another unconfirmed victory, and he had actually typed out an affidavit for them to sign before he left on the mission. And so he had them sign it, and he said, "Thank you very much." He got in his Spad. They attempted to start the Spad, and it wouldn't start. The plane had been riddled with anti-aircraft fire, and it would no longer start. How he made it that far is a mystery. But he was able to catch a ride with a dispatch rider in his sidecar of a motorcycle back to the 27th Squadron's airfield at Rambuku, and he walked into Grant's office and he laid the affidavit on his desk and said, "I got you a balloon." And so that was his first confirmed victory. The next day, they sent a truck and some mechanics out to fetch his airplane. They brought it back, and it was so badly damaged it could never fly again. And the maintenance chief looked at it and he said, "This thing is completely full of holes." And he looked at Frank and he said, "I can't believe that you're not completely full of holes." And Frank just laughed and he said, "They can't get me." So the St. Mihiel offensive was a complete success. They rolled the Germans back 40 kilometers before they hit a defensive line known as the Hindenburg Line. And it was a complete success. On 14 September 1918, the squadron was sent again on another balloon mission to a balloon company, a German balloon company that was headquartered at Boinville. And they divided the squadron into flights. One flight was to attack the balloons. The other flights were to fly high cover. And Frank was eager to go. He went in, attacked the balloon at Boinville. He made 5 separate passes through the anti-aircraft fire to attack this balloon. 2 other pilots, Dawson and Lennon, from his squadron also made one pass each, and the balloon did not explode, but it deflated from all the holes that they punched in it. And they said in their combat reports that last time they saw the balloon, it was lying on the ground, quote unquote, in a very flabby condition. So they returned to Rambuku, and they received a warning order from Harold Hartney, the commander of the group, of First Pursuit Group, who said that there was a balloon that was up at a location called Buzi, and it was on the left flank of the American forces, and it was directing accurate artillery fire, was holding up the advance. First Corps was telling them, yelling at the air servers, you got to get rid of that balloon. And so the warning order came down on the 27th, that balloon's got to go. So they were preparing for that mission. The same time that was going on, the two gentlemen that were involved in the same attack with Frank said, I'm the one who shot down the balloon. They said, no, you're not. You may have attacked it 5 times, but we're the ones that attacked it last. So there was a big argument between the two. Grant, the commander of the 27th, this guy here, and Dawson and Lennon and their flight commander, Clapp, they all went to go see Harold Hartney at his headquarters, and they basically said, Luke is a menace to morale, we want him out of the squadron. Just an interesting aside right here, this you see them in this formation here, in their flag is the 27th Squadron flag, and by the time that this was done, by the time this had been taken, it was no longer the aviation section of the Army Signal Corps, it was the U.S. Army Air Service, but the flag still says
Signal.
Still has the Signal Corps there. You see the 27, you see the semaphore flags, which is a symbol of the Signal Corps, and then you see the aviators' wings. And an interesting thing about this, just recently I saw a diary from a soldier that was a mechanic assigned to the 27th, and in his diary he said that he had talked to the guy that was holding the flag when this picture was taken, and he said, hey man, that's the wrong flag. We don't belong to the Signal Corps anymore. And the guy said to him, 100 years from now, who's going to know the difference?
Yeah.
Me.
It's true.
Okay. So, I thought that was hilarious. Okay, so anyway, so you got Grant, and then you have Clapp, this schmo right here, and they were making the big stink to Hartney. This is Hartney down here in the corner, and they were telling him that Frank had to go out of the squadron, and they were actually, in my opinion, they were rather insubordinate to Hartney, and they told him, I tell you what, we'll make a deal with you. We'll go get the balloon at Buzi. We'll make Frank go. If he gets it, he can stay in the squadron. If he fails, you have to transfer him to another squadron. Now, being in the military myself, being a leader myself, I wouldn't have put up with that myself. But I think Hartney was a different sort, and the way he looked at it was, all right, fine. If he gets it, you guys have to shut up and don't bother me with him anymore. And he is staying in your squadron. So he agreed to it. So they took off for Buzi. This was their second mission of the day. And Frank attacked the balloon at Buzi and he shot it down. He closed in on the balloon so fast that the other pilots in the squadron, the flying high cover, they said they thought he was going to ram it. And at the last minute, it exploded. Frank headed for a second balloon that he saw in the same area, and he shot it down before he was intercepted by 2 German Fokker D-7s that were flying high cover for the balloon line. He had 2 German airplanes on his tail, first time that ever happened for him. He was twisting and turning and trying to get away. Out of nowhere came Joe Wehner, the German spy, supposedly. He dove on the German aircraft, and just in time, and he was able to chase them off Frank's tail and saved his life. So they returned to Frank and Joe were separated from the rest of the formation during this melee, and the rest of the aircraft returned to the squadron. Well, they assumed that Frank had been killed. They didn't see Joseph Wehner chase the enemy airplanes off of his tail. And so by the time Frank gets back, the same guys that were complaining and saying they wanted him out of his squadron were reporting back to Harold Hartney saying Frank had been killed. You know, he went out in a blaze of glory. You should have seen him. It was audacious. It was the bravest thing we've ever seen. And then the phone rang. The phone rang because the 27th Squadron was calling Frank. His plane was so shot up it wouldn't fly again, and so he wanted to borrow somebody else's plane and go after another balloon that he saw on the way home. And Grant, Captain Grant, was arguing with Frank. No, it's not going to happen. The man who called the First Pursuit Group headquarters said, Frank Lucas here, he's crazy as a bedbug. And so Hartney had to run across the airfield, had to get in between Frank and Captain Grant and settle the matter. Vayner actually went off and got the balloon himself later. Okay, so the 15th of September 1918, the next day. It's a day, I call this the Day of the Aces. Remarkable day. So what happened was Luke and Vayner got up again. They went to team up to do a balloon mission. Vayner, though, had engine trouble, and he took off after Frank. Frank took off without him. Frank went up to the same area, Wonville, where he was the day before. He saw a German balloon that was there. He attacked it and destroyed it. And before it even hit the ground, he spotted another one that the Germans had winched up in a wooded area that they called the Bois d'Engrais. He went after that balloon and shot it down. And then he was attacked by 8, count them, 8 Fokker D-7 fighter planes that were on his tail. And he was roaring through the smoke, heading for the American lines as fast as he could. Again, out of nowhere, in the nick of time, like something out of a Hollywood film, Joe Vayner came down from a height. He had actually fixed his problem with his airplane. He had taken off, found a balloon, shot it down, and then saw that Luke was in trouble, and shot a Fokker off of Frank's tail, and the two of them rushed for the American lines, and they made it to safety. The Germans were still in hot pursuit. They were rather irritated, but they were held off by American anti-aircraft fire once they got to the front line. So Vayner flew a second patrol after that. He destroyed another balloon, and on his way home, he saw an American observation aircraft that was under attack by German Fokkers, and he shot down another one. And for that, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The two flew another patrol that day, right at twilight, and Luke spotted a light in the sky. He thought at first it was a German observation plane, but as he got closer, he saw that it was a light that was in the gondola of an observation balloon. Light discipline? I guess they forgot about light discipline. So he shot that one down. By the time he got back to the American lines, it was dark, and he landed his airplane in a wheat field outside of a town called Angers. And he hitchhiked back to the airfield. He got back there it was after midnight by the time he got back, but when he got back, they were having a party for Joseph Vayner. So the gentleman that they shunned as a spy, they were now having a party for him because he had become an ace that day, and so had Frank. Both of them became aces that day. So I mentioned that he attacked in twilight, and what Frank and Joe discovered that night was that they realized that the Germans were what Bill Malden, the famous cartoonist from the Stars and Stripes, he called German soldiers unimaginative time clock punchers, and this was an example of that. What they found out was that the Germans would winch a balloon up. They would have a fighter patrol overhead, and right before twilight, the German airplanes left because it was time to go home. But the Germans in the observation balloon wanted to get one last peek before there was darkness, before they winched the balloon down. So there was an interval where they didn't have fighter cover. Frank and Joe picked up on that, and they made a proposition to Harold Hartney and said, we want to do a balloon show right at twilight. There's 3 balloons, and we're going to get all 3 of them. This irritated Captain Grant because it went around him to get to Major Hartney and get permission. But Hartney called out Colonel Mitchell, who was the air commander, and to watch the show, as they put it. Come on out to Rambouillet and watch the show. So right at twilight, Frank was ready to take off, and he walked past Eddie Rickenbacker, there's Eddie right there, who was a good-natured guy, and Eddie had the lead for the Ace of Aces competition at the time, and Frank said, keep your eye on the balloons, Eddie. And he went to his plane and they took off. And they were all watching, and within a few minutes they saw one balloon explode, another balloon explode, a third balloon explode. They got all three of them. So Frank got 2 of those.
Plus the ground crew, because they had a lot of people on the ground crew.
Yeah, they were winching the balloons down at that time, and they were able. They actually, when they exploded the balloons, they actually took out a lot of the ground crew. That's true. Of the 3 of them, Vayner got 1 of them, and Joe got 2. Frank got 2. So that actually put Frank in the lead to be America's ace of aces, and he had surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker at the time. Eddie Rickenbacker was a good sport about it. He shook Frank's hand, and was a good sport about it. On 17 September, and imagine this is just a few days what we're talking here. On 17 September of 1918, Frank and Joe took the day off. Their version of taking the day off was to get a squadron car, and go to the front and scavenge for German machine guns. They wanted them as souvenirs, and so they found a couple of them in a abandoned German position. They brought them back to the airfield, they cleaned them up, they put them in boxes to ship them home. Try doing that today in America's military and see what happens to you. So they were busily cleaning these things up and shooting the breeze and having a good time, and somebody said, well, Frank, what do you want with these machine guns? And he says, I don't know, maybe Pancho Villa will come back over the border in Arizona, and well, I'm going to need one. So Frank and Joe were in high spirits that day. The next day, 18 September 1918. Again, they took off to attack German balloon positions at twilight. And when that happened, Frank spotted a balloon at an area, they called it the Three-Fingered Lake. And Luke found a balloon, he attacked it. As he was attacking it, he destroyed it, and he moved toward another one. And he saw that there were 2 Fokker D-7 German fighter planes that were descending to intercept him. Frank also saw them. I'm sorry, Joe also saw them. He fired 2 red flares to warn Frank. Frank said he never saw that happen, but actually the Germans that were involved in the engagement said that they saw it happen. That's what drew their attention to Joseph Vayner. So Frank destroyed the second balloon. He figured that he was going to have just enough time to destroy the second balloon before he was intercepted by the German aircraft. So he climbed away from the second one that he destroyed with 2 Fokkers on his tail, and he looked up and saw that Joe was engaged by 5. It was 1 to 5. And Frank was too far away. As Frank was climbing to go help out Joe with 2 German planes on his tail, he witnessed Joe's plane burst into flames and start falling to earth. Frank then turned on his pursuers, made a 180-degree turn, roared at them head-on, shot them both down. He then scoured the area to try to find any sign of Joseph Vayner. He was unable to do so. His aircraft was running low on fuel. He started heading back to the American lines. As he headed back to the American lines, he saw a German observation plane that was being stalked by 2 aircraft from a French squadron, 2 SPADs from a French squadron that was known as the Cigognes. Cigognes means storks, and they were actually friends of Frank. And Frank was closer to the German observation plane than they were, and he was able to sneak in ahead of them and shoot it down. He then landed in a field near Verdun, where the Navy had put in an artillery battery. He landed there. Soon the phone rang at 1st Pursuit Group headquarters, and Harold Hartney was called to the phone, and he was told, Lieutenant Luke has landed near Verdun at the Naval Artillery Battery. Somebody's going to have to come get him. We can't bring him to you. And so, because of the fact that they had a report that one of their planes was shot down, and they knew that Frank was safe, that it could only mean that it was Joseph Vayner that had been killed. So Hartney figured that, they were very close friends, and Hartney figured that I'm going to have to be the one to break the news to him. I'm not going to send somebody else out to get him. So he went and got Eddie Rickenbacker, and they got in a squadron car, and they drove to Verdun. And Frank was sitting next to his shot-up plane in the field, and when he saw who was coming out to get him, he knew. And the first thing he said was, "Joe isn't back yet, is he, Major?" Well, they took him back to Rambouillet, and there were some American entertainers that were there on a public relations tour, and they were throwing a party. They actually threw a party for Frank because Frank was the ace of aces, and as they were celebrating that, the 94 Squadron, Eddie Rickenbacker's squadron, threw the party for him. And toward the end of the party, they said, "Let's hear from our ace of aces, Frank Luke, speech." And so Frank stood up and he said, "Guys, I've only done what all of us were sent here to do. I'm not special. I'm doing what the rest of us are sent here to do, and my job is to get as many of them as I can before they get me." And he said, "But they're never going to take me alive." The next day, the Army sent a publicity photographer out to take some public relations photos of Frank, and they went to the place where the German observation plane had been shot down, and it was surrounded by French troops. It took some doing to get in and actually get a picture taken because the French didn't want to let them near the aircraft, but they did. There was it's actually kind of gruesome because the bodies of the two Germans were still in the plane when this picture was taken. But this is the Frank posing next to the LVG two-seater that he shot down. An American soldier told Harold Hartney, he said, "We saw the two Frenchies stalking that German, and then the American came in and shot him down. Have you ever heard an entire American division cheer?" So Frank, however, was not in a mood. These are the pictures that were taken that day. Frank was in no mood to be celebratory. Look at his face. Obviously, he was very distraught over losing his best friend, and at that point, Frank wasn't talking to anybody. Any effort to congratulate him or to console him, he wouldn't even respond. He was fairly catatonic, as you can see from these photographs. And the most famous photograph of him was taken that same day, and you can see he has the same look on his face, right there. So obviously he was very distraught. He wasn't going to be any good to anybody, so Harold Hartney decided to send him on a furlough. So Harold said, "You're going to Paris for 10 days, and Frank said, "I don't want to," and Hartney said, "It's in order." And so in Hartney's memoirs, what he said is, "The next day, almost by force, we sent him off on a leave to Paris. It was a vacation of a highly unsuccessful nature." He wanted no hilarity. So Frank went to the most famous wartime city in history, Paris, France, in 1918, with all of the wine, women, and song, and he wanted nothing to do with it. He stayed in a hotel for a couple of days, and before long he was back at Rambouillet. And Harold Hartney said, "Aren't you back early?" And Frank said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he says, "Why? I sent you there for 10 days. And Frank said, "There wasn't anything to do." While he was gone, the 27th Squadron had set up an advanced airfield at Verdun. The offensive had been so successful they pushed the German lines way back 40 kilometers, and so they went from a 30-minute flight time to almost an hour to get to the front lines to engage the Germans. So they set up an advanced airfield near Verdun, and it was staffed by the B flight of the 27th Squadron. Jerry Vasconcelos was the leader at that, was the commander of that airfield. Jerry was all too happy to do that. He didn't get along with Grant either, and so he was all too happy to go up to Verdun. These are some very rare photographs of that airfield that I came across, and you can see there were some French hangars that were there, and this was right after the field had been shelled by German artillery. You can see there's an American Samson two-seater that is upside down after the shelling. They were very close to the front lines, and when I mean close, I mean very close. This is a sketch that was done by a soldier that was assigned as a mechanic to the 27th Aero Squadron B Flight, and he called it the Saga of B Flight. Here's the hangars, here's the airstrip, here's the German front line right here over the hill. Hartney had described this airfield and saying that we could feel that the Germans were just over the brow of the hill. And you can see the sketch here. It's marked German front lines, German artillery, French artillery, and you can see the flight path. When they took off, they had to make 90-degree turns so they weren't flying directly over the German lines there. So the whole idea was that that airfield was going to be used as an alert field in case German aircraft were spotted, and as a refueling and rearming point for the American planes that were attacking the Germans and supporting the offensive. On 26 September 1918, Frank had requested to be reassigned to the Verdun airfield. Number one, he wanted to be closer to the balloon line so he could be more successful. He was the ace of aces after all, and he should be given free rein to do what he wanted to do. He also wanted to get away from Captain Grant. He didn't want to fly formation flying. He didn't want to go out on patrols. He wanted to do his own thing. Captain Grant told him, no, absolutely not. You're going to fall in line like everybody else. You're going to fly the patrols that are assigned to you. You are a second lieutenant. Frank was assigned to go out with a new pilot. His name was Ivan Roberts, Second Lieutenant Ivan Roberts. They had a patrol over German-held territory. Ivan Roberts they were attacked by German Fokker D-7s, engaged in a dogfight. Frank got separated from Ivan Roberts. He was later credited as a confirmed kill to a German ace that reported to have shot him down. However, Ivan Roberts was never heard from again. He was, ironically enough, he was from same town, Massachusetts. The body and his aircraft were never found. So once again, Frank lost his wingman. He returned from this action, and a young pilot by the name of Kenneth Porter from the 147th Aero Squadron that shared the same airfield came up to him and said, "There's no bullet holes in your airplane. What's the matter? Are you slipping?" And Frank said, "Very funny. I tell you what. There's a balloon that's up at Bethenville, and by the day after tomorrow, after you guys in the 147th go after it and you all fail, I'm going to go over there and bring it in." And he made good on his word. On 28 September 1918, he went over to Bethenville, and after several attacks by American aircraft that failed, Luke went in, shot it down. So, that night, Frank landed over at the Storks airfield, the Les Cigognes, the same Frenchman that he snuck up on and shot down the two-seater out from underneath them. He was actually pretty good friends with some of these guys. He had spent the night there at their airfield before. He didn't tell anybody he was doing it. He went over to Bethenville, shot down the balloon, and then he flew over to the Cigognes airfield and spent the night there with his French pals. Much to the irritation of his commanding officer, as you can imagine. So on 29 September 1918, Frank showed up at the airfield at Rambouillet. And the cast of characters for this day, you've got Alfred Grant, Captain Grant, Major Hartney, and you got Jerry Vasconcelos. So Frank showed up late, turned in his report, said, "I got you." Basically what happened was Captain Grant said, "Where the hell have you been, Luke?" And he said, "I've been over at Les Cigognes and I got you another balloon." Grant was furious. He had not, he hadn't called, he hadn't made any communication at all. He was absent without leave, basically, and he told Frank, "You're grounded until further notice." Frank saluted, did an about-face, walked right out of the office, went right out to the hangar, told the mechanics, "Fuel it up." So, a few minutes later, the number 26 Spada, the 27th Aero Squadron, took off and headed toward Verdun, to the advanced airfield at Verdun, and somebody told Captain Grant that was Luke. Right after he grounded them, he left the airfield. So, Captain Grant said, "I want you to get a hold of Captain Vasconcelos at the Verdun airfield, and you want to tell him that when Luke gets there, you place him under arrest and ship him back here." And his adjutant said to him, "And then what are you going to do?" And Captain Grant said, "Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend him for the Distinguished Service Cross. The second thing, I'm going to court-martial him." So Grant then stormed across the airfield to Harold Hartney's office, Major Hartney's office, and he said, "Look, I can't handle this guy unless you back me up. He was telling me that you gave him permission to fly tonight. I never gave him any orders he could fly tonight. Why are you allowing him to continually go around me and go to you to get orders?" I don't know about you, but I'm kind of on Grant's side with that one. That was pretty insubordinate of Luke. But our hero flew up to Verdun, and Hartney actually lied to Grant and said, well, yes, I did give him orders. He hadn't. So I'll go up to Verdun and I'll make sure that he gets shipped back. So Hartney went out to the hangar. He borrowed a Sopwith Camel. He flew up to the Verdun airfield. And Luke was there with Jerry Vasconcelos. When Hartney landed, Luke ran up to his airplane and he said, Major, there's 3 Hun balloons up there on the Moose River. If you let me go right now, I can get all 3 of them. And Hartney said, hold on, Luke, hold on. The sun's going to set at 17:26 hours. I want you taking off no later than that. And so Frank was, chomping at the bit, very anxious. Hartney rescinded the order to arrest Luke, and so that was taken off the table. And so what they did was they repaired to Jerry Vasconcelos' dugout. The Navy had a artillery piece that was there that was taken off of a battleship. It was a 14-inch gun, and this is an actual photograph of that gun at that, pretty cool, huh? At that airfield. And you can see that there was a railroad spur line. They had that gun that was right there, and they had a locomotive that pulled it back and forth. And this thing, which would hurl shells for miles, they would pack huge bags of powder in there along with the shell and fire the weapon. The thing is that the way that the spur line was and where Jerry Vasconcelos' dugout was, he was basically right underneath the barrel of this thing. And it was extremely loud when it went off. And so Jerry decided it'd be a great idea to pull one of his favorite pranks. He invited the 2 of them, Hartney and Luke, into his dugout and said, I'm going to pour some coffee for you. And right about the time he was pouring coffee, he had a feel for the interval of how long it would take between shots. As soon as he poured coffee for his guests, the Navy fired the gun, coffee cups went flying. So that's how they passed the time. So at 17:26, Frank went out to the aircraft, actually a little bit early, went out to his aircraft, got it started. Hartney chewed him out, said, damn it, Luke, I told you, don't take off until 17:26 hours. Hartney then departed. That was the last time he ever saw Frank Luke. Frank Luke was actually laughing at him as he was being chewed out. And it was probably the first time that Frank had laughed in several days. 17:26 hours, the Spad took off. Luke Spad took off from the airfield at Verdun. He didn't go directly over the German lines, though. He went from there to a position called Avocore, and there was an American balloon company that was there. He flew low over the American balloon company. He dropped a note, and the note said, watch the 3 Hun balloons on the Moose, Lieutenant Luke. Luke was pretty well known by that time, and so they knew who he was. And so the American balloon observers started watching the German balloon positions, and shortly thereafter, they saw one explode, they saw a second one explode, they saw a third one explode. So they called First Pursuit headquarters and they said, it's confirmed, Luke got all 3 balloons. So they waited for Luke to return to Verdun. He didn't return to Verdun. They waited for him to return to Rambouillet. He didn't return to Rambouillet. They waited for him to show up at Les Cigognes. He didn't show up there either. There was a correspondent from the Phoenix Republican that was at the Rambouillet airfield, and in his dispatch from the front that night he wrote, we were all waiting for him to come roaring out of the north with another tale of hairbreadth escape, but he didn't. So what happened?
Did
Yes.
you talk to Don about what he thinks might happen with Luke?
Yes.
Okay.
So it was a mystery for a while. What happened? The First Pursuit group got a rumor. They heard a rumor that Frank had landed in no man's land, and he was running for the American lines, and he got mowed down by German machine gun fire. There was no word from that turned out to be completely false. There was no word from the Germans what had happened to him for several weeks. Shortly before the armistice, there was word that Frank had been killed. That it was a message that was given from the German army to the International Red Cross that Frank had been killed, but it didn't give any details. it wasn't until after the war was over. When Frank took off that night, he didn't know that the war was going to be over in 6 weeks. I personally think that one of the reasons why Frank was the way he was, why he was as grief-stricken as he was, I think he was grief-stricken for Joe, but I think he also got a glimpse into his own mortality at that point. I don't think he felt invincible anymore, and I think part of it was he had a very fatalistic view, and I think he knew what his outcome was going to be when he said they're never going to take me alive, because I think he knew that he couldn't do the job any other way than full speed ahead. And so the odds were stacked against him, and eventually he couldn't continue to do that. He had no way of knowing that the very day that he left the airfield at Verdun, that Ludendorff and Hindenburg, the two men in charge of the German army, went and visited the Kaiser that very day and said, "We don't think we can hold the Western Front for another 24 hours. The war was over in 6 weeks. But that night, Frank disappeared. And it wasn't until after the war, in 1919, that American soldiers belonging to the Graves Registration Office, they were searching the area around the Argonne Forest, where there was a huge fight going on. But after the war, they were searching for the bodies of American troops to make sure that they were all brought home. They went into a little village called Mirvu that was off the Meuse River, right around the same area where Frank was last seen. They spoke to some villagers there, and the villagers told them that on 29th September of 1918, an American aviator flew over their village after destroying the 3 balloons. There were German soldiers in the village. The aviator saw them. He nosed down for a strafing run. He opened fire. He killed 6 German soldiers and wounded 6 more. He then flew along a ridge called the Côte Saint-Germain, which is just outside of the village. This is the village of Mirvu right here. I visited there in 2010, and Colonel Simon, when I first met him, he said, I think if you took a photograph of Mirvu in today and you compared it with one 100 years ago, it wouldn't have changed much. And I think he hit the nail on the head. It has, from everything that I know of Mirvu back then and Mirvu today, hasn't changed much at all. But anyway, the villagers said that after that Frank came out of the south here and came over the village, strafed the German troops, and they flew along the Côte Saint-Germain right here. There were German anti-aircraft batteries on that hill, and they opened fire on him. And they believe at that time that's when he was hit. And he then landed his aircraft basically at the base of this ridge right here. There's a little creek running right through here that was known as Millie Creek, and there were some trees that were there. There were some eyewitnesses in these houses that saw the whole thing happen. And they said that he landed his aircraft, kind of a hard landing, got out of his airplane, and he made a run for the trees. Looking for some cover in the trees there. And they witnessed the German soldiers from the village, who were probably very ill-tempered after he had just strafed them, coming after him. He instead of surrendering, he had made the statement he was never going to be taken alive. So he turned on the German troops. He drew his service automatic and opened fire. Shortly after that, he fell into the grass right there at the base of Côte Saint-Germain, and he was dead from a wound that he had received in the right side of his chest that had actually exited the left side of his chest. The villagers came out with a wagon, and they were to take him to the village cemetery. They wanted to put some straw on the bottom of the wagon to lay him in the straw. And the German lieutenant that got there first kicked the body and said, "Get this thing out of my way as soon as possible." And so they buried Frank in the village cemetery. The American troops then exhumed the body. Of course, they didn't have DNA type technology back in those days, but they went by the physical description of Frank Luke. And they discovered that the Germans had missed the fact that he had a wristwatch on an Elgin wristwatch on his wrist, and Frank Luke had the same type of watch, and they said it's very certain that this is Frank Luke. So there's some pictures of the Moose River Valley right there. So Frank was moved. Frank's body was moved then to Roman, to the Meuse Argonne cemetery, where he still rests today. His family was asked, do they want to ship his body home, and his father said, no, I want you to leave him over there with his brothers in arms. And he was asked about it, and he said, Frank would have wanted that, I know that. And so that's where he's buried today. In 1919, at a public ceremony in Phoenix, Arizona, Frank was awarded the Medal of Honor for his final mission on 29 September 1918. The medal was presented to his father at a ceremony in Phoenix, Arizona. Frank was the first aviator in history to receive the Medal of Honor. He was the only American pilot to receive the Medal of Honor during the First World War. Eddie Rickenbacker received it. One of his awards was upgraded to Medal of Honor later on, but Frank was the only one that was recommended for a Medal of Honor during the war.
By commander.
Yes, by Alfred Grant, the same man he butted heads with. He didn't actually write the citation, but he was the one that recommended it. So there have been several tributes to Frank over the years. In 1930, they erected a statue. It was private funds were raised to put the statue of Frank, and it was really the first military tribute that was done at the Arizona State Capitol. If you go down there today, there's many of them, but this was the first one that was placed there, and so that was put in place in 1930. The U.S. Army Air Service established an airfield on Ford Island, which is right smack in the middle of Pearl Harbor, during the 1920s and 1930s, and it was called Luke Army Airfield. There is another tribute to him. There is a very small town on the Arizona border, such as it is. If you've ever driven to Rocky Point, you've probably driven right through Lukeville. Perhaps the most auspicious honor.
And they found out, well, gosh, we're flying over enemy lines. We can drop bombs. They carried bombs between their legs, and they threw them out. The other thing is,
and they were contact fuses, so you had to be really careful.
The other thing that is kind of funny, the Vickers was a good machine gun, but it would jam up. So one of his main tools that he brought up with him when he took flight was a hammer, and he beat the crap out of it until it started shooting.
That's true. If you look at a cockpit of a SPAD, there's usually a bracket that's down right between the pilot's legs, down to the left of the stick, and there's usually a mallet that's there just for the express purposes of beating on the big machine gun.
One other observation:
yes,
what was the figure of civilian loss of life? It was like 41 or 43 million. Yeah. When we went in, no, not 1,000 million. When we went on a tour, I think it was an American Express tour, and I was enlisted at the time with the Air Guard. I took a trip, and we were going through France. First of all, France does not have a road network like Germany does with the Autobahn, and that was one of the reasons why Hitler always strafed villages to put the villagers on the road so the French couldn't move. Very, very smart. But anyhow, when we were in this bus, we were going, forever on the stinking bus, and I saw these statues and monuments way off of the road, all by themselves. And after about the 12th or 13th, I went up to the bus driver and I said, "I'm just not understanding. What are these memorials doing out here?" And he said, "Well, this was a major invasion line during World War I. And these villages were totally wiped out. No one came home." I said, "You gotta be joking." I said, "I've seen at least 10 of them." He said, "You'll see more." So when you look at that in relationship to the amount of people that were lost, it just is phenomenal. The other thing that's interesting to note, Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, was sent as the ultimate commander of all of our forces in France at the time. And the British and the French were just thrilled because they needed the manpower. And they greeted him with open arms, and they said, you know, we've got this villa over here for you. Why would I need a villa? He says, we're going to take your troops because we know the war. We understand the war. So we're just going to take your troops and then put you in the villa. And he said, we're going to go home. I'm commander. That was it.
When you mentioned memorials, I just want, if anybody's ever goes over there, I'm sure you'll agree, the American cemeteries that are there are absolutely phenomenal. They are the most immaculately landscaped and manicured landscapes you'll ever see. They are perfect. They're run by the American Battlefields Monuments Commission, and they are the smallest agency of the federal government. But they run several of the American memorial cemeteries from World War I and World War II in Europe, and they are really amazing when you go there. And the people that run them are very well versed in the history of the battles from the soldiers that are buried.
And
Yes, sir.
all facing west towards the United States.
They're all facing west toward the United States. That's correct. Yes.
From the maps, I couldn't tell how far apart the balloons were when he took them down. Were they 30 miles apart? Or?
No, they weren't that far apart. They were they were close enough to be seen with the naked eye a lot of the times because he was able to see them and go after them after there was no real set interval. It was wherever they thought they should place them to do their observations. But the night that he went up after the 3 balloons, there were over 20 of them that were in the area. Yeah, they made extensive use of the observation balloons. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, before the Americans got involved with the war, like in 1914 or 15,
Mm-hmm.
okay, there were Americans who went over and flew or
Yes.
fought with the French and the British. There must have been some who went to Germany.
There were.
Do you have any info on that?
Not as many, but it actually did occur. There were some German Americans that went over and fought on the German side, and some that actually flew in the German Air Corps. One gentleman, before America entered the war, his airplane was actually painted red, white, and blue with German crosses on it. After America entered the war, they made him change that. But yeah, that actually did happen. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Wasn't that characteristics of the Maxims jamming like that?
Yeah, the machine guns that were being used by the Americans were actually British Vickers machine guns, and they were very temperamental. Yeah.
I think both the British and the Germans used the Maxim design,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure about the French, but I heard that was a characteristic of them because of their action.
Mm-hmm. The French were actually using the Vickers also, and the reason why is they found that the Vickers was lent itself better to the synchronization than some of their weapons. They found that the Vickers was better at synchronizing, but they were very temperamental. They were very prone to jamming. On several of Luke's missions, he had to stop and clear jams in between attacks on the balloons. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell the story about the flowers?
Yeah, the story about the flowers. When Frank came home on his leave, prior to being shipped overseas, he wanted to visit a lot of his friends, and he wanted to go to a Phoenix Union high school football game in his uniform and everything. And the game was about ready to start, and he was about halfway out the door, and then Tilly, his mother, said, Frank, I need you to do me a favor. Could you plant some bulbs for some flowers? And so Frank went to the garden, and he just really hurriedly dug some holes and stuck the bulbs in the holes, and he covered them up with soil, and he left for the game. And a few months later, as you probably know, the bulbs take a while to bloom, and the flowers bloomed on September 29th. And the family said, "Look at this, Mom, come out here and look at this." And they went out and looked at the bulbs that were blooming, and Frank had put them in the shape of an airplane. And Bill Luke, Chrysler Plymouth, that's Frank's little brother. Bill said that his mom looked at the bulbs that were blooming, and she said something happened to Frank. And there's no way she could have known, but when she looked at it, she said something happened to Frank. She knew in her heart that something had gone wrong.
One other quick thing, and it's not related to World War II, it's not World War I, but World War II. We went to several cemeteries. One of the cemeteries we went to is in Luxembourg, where Patton is buried. And he's all by himself because when they originally buried him in Luxembourg, they had him buried amongst his troops in the middle of the cemetery. And his wife protested about that. He said, George wouldn't want to be the head of his troops. The last slap in the face, and probably somebody who didn't like to do this, well, he got his separate place right by where all the monuments are. But guess what? All of his troops and all their names with all their crosses, Italian marble, got their backsides to the commander. Did you go there?
No,
Did you get to see it?
no, I haven't made it to Luxembourg.
And the cemetery where he was buried is actually the church cemetery. We got to film a lot of that. And he was actually buried with the German troops because of his name, Luke. So,
Yes, ma'am.
Bill and Sandy, didn't you say that the information is wrong by the Capitol, by
It
the
is, yeah.
statute?
Yeah, it is wrong. The birth year is wrong.
We're trying to get that changed. That's
Yeah.
gotta be
That's not going to
changed.
happen.
You don't think?
No.
That's terrible.
Well, it was an oversight that the sculptor did, but yeah, the birth year actually says 1898
Right.
to 1918, and it was actually 1897. He was 21 when he died, not 20. But I don't know. The Luke family would probably have a conniption if you tried to mess with that statue, I would think. But good luck. Good luck with that.
Keith, we appreciate you being here with us. We have a
Thank you very much, folks.
token of appreciation. It says, certificate of appreciation, Keith Warren Lloyd, for his presentation of Above and Beyond, January 25th, 2018.
Thank you. Thank you very much, folks, for having me.
Thank you for letting us borrow him tonight. Okay, this is his wife back here.
If you guys are interested in the book, I do have copies,
Yep.
if you're interested.
It's excellent, you guys. Like Bill said, it's an easy read. You learn so much. He has so many neat
Pretty much told
details.
you how it ends, though.
Yeah.
With pictures.
That was great.